there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, this year and particularly this month about the two-state solution. And I thought there's most of it is superficial, so let's go a little deeper. And what I argue in the piece is that there's a fundamental problem here that is being completely ignored by the Europeans, Canadians, Australians, which is that Palestinians have never wanted a state. That's not the purpose of Palestinian nationalism. The purpose of Palestinian nationalism is to destroy the Jewish state.
Elliott Abrams, welcome back to Reaganism. Great to have you here.
Great to be here, Roger. Thank you.
Well, you are currently with the Council on Foreign Relations, where you're a senior fellow for Middle East Studies. You're also the chairman of Tikva. We've had you recently on a book you wrote on anti-Semitism in the United States. But today we're here for another subject in which you're expert in, and that is the discussion of Palestinian statehood. You have worked on this in one form or another throughout your career, on Capitol Hill, in the Reagan administration, and the George W. Bush administration, in a senior role where this was within your portfolio. And, of course, you worked in the Trump administration, too. Formerly, that wasn't part of your portfolio as far as I'm aware of. But nonetheless, have been a close watcher of this issue. And you recently wrote an extensive essay in Mosaic. The title is "There Will Never Be a Palestinian State, So What's Next?" Actually, the subheadline is one that doesn't get as much coverage, but I think perhaps shares more. It says, "October 7 was not Palestine's Independence Day, but the final nail in the two-state solution's coffin. Is confederation with Jordan all that remains? Question mark." Elliott, great to have you back. Tell us a little bit about this piece and what prompted you to write it. Obviously, events at the General Assembly this week perhaps is the obvious response here.
Yeah, there's been a lot of discussion, obviously, this year and particularly this month about the two-state solution. And I thought there's most of it is superficial, so let's go a little deeper. And what I argue in the piece is that there's a fundamental problem here that is being completely ignored by the Europeans, Canadians, Australians, which is that Palestinians have never wanted a state. That's not the purpose of Palestinian nationalism. The purpose of Palestinian nationalism is to destroy the Jewish state. Go back to 1937, the Peel Commission. The Brits said there ought to be partition.
Right.
The Jews said, great. The Arabs said, no. 1947, the UN Resolution 181 says, partition, Jewish state, Arab state. Tiny Jewish state. But the Zionist movement said yes, because they wanted a state. In fact, let me just read you a line from the foreign minister of the UK then in 47, Ernest Bevin, anti-Semite, anti-Zionist. And he said two sentences. For the Jews, the essential point of principle is the creation of a sovereign Jewish state. For the Arabs, the essential point of principle is to resist to the last the establishment of Jewish sovereignty in any part of Palestine. That's the problem. And the assumption on the part of these countries that, well, we'll magically say, poof, you're a Palestinian state, and that will solve all the problems, just completely denies the truth about this.
So this is an important distinction. Indeed, armed struggle was armed struggle not for independence as much as armed struggle against a Jewish state, which is the point you just made. So why the preoccupation? I mean, we just started this conversation a couple minutes ago, and we have the Prime Minister of UK, Australia, Canada, and we can't leave out the French. Macron for a moment suggested he was going to hold off on recognizing a Palestinian state until hostages were released. Again, we could explore the linkage there and whether that's sound logically or diplomatically. But, of course, he ended up joining the others in the UN recently. On the one hand, you have these allies, the closest allies of the United States. And then you have the Abraham Accord states, just by contrast, who are not doing the same thing. In other words, those in the neighborhood, right, the Arab brethren of the Palestinians, are not leading the way, whereas you have the Western sort of NATO allies, in Australia's case, and, ANZUS. I mean, these are the United States close allies that are preoccupied with this. Take us through their logic. Obviously, there's domestic politics at play, but even that, it seems so off for the allies that freed the world of Nazism. Now they seem to be giving sort of cover and support to Hamas.
I think there's a lot of domestic politics here. You're talking about countries, take Australia, take the UK, take France, where the Muslim populations outnumber the Jewish population by 10 to 1, 12 to 1, 14 to 1. And these are weak governments. These are governments that have very low popularity ratings in their own polls. So this is just throwing a bone, I would argue, to the left primarily, and to Muslim populations in those countries. These are democracies, and the elected prime ministers or presidents are in trouble and trying to get themselves a little bit out of trouble by sacrificing Israel and their own Jewish populations. It's pretty discreditable. And the really striking thing about it is the point you just made. It isn't that they said, okay, we're ready. We're going to recognize a Palestinian state as soon as the following conditions are met, as soon as the hostages are released, as soon as there is something that looks like a potential Palestinian government in Ramallah with all of the reforms that are made. Instead, they don't mention the hostages, and they accept from the Palestinian president, Mahmoud Abbas, a series of pledges, of promises about reforms that he has been making literally since he became president 19 years ago. And since then...
It's a very long term in office. A very long term in office.
Yep. So that's, I think, almost the worst part of it. If you're going to do this, okay, just set the conditions, but not even the release of hostages. What it shows you is it isn't about Palestine. It isn't about the Palestinian people. It's about a combination of domestic politics and striking out at punishing the government of Israel.
Right. I mean, they're not Netanyahu fans. They have to deal with their Muslim populations, as you point out. Flip it, though, Elliott. Explain why we have the durability of the Abraham Accords. Now, the perhaps behind the scenes, if you look at the stories in terms of what drove this moment in the UN General Assembly with these votes in favor of a Palestinian state, the KSA, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, seemed to have been collaborating with Macron, and others joined in. But it doesn't seem to be led by the Abraham Accord countries. Of course, Saudi Arabia is not a part of yet, and they're not the ones driving it. I mean, of course, they're not going to stand in the way of it. I mean, that tells you something, doesn't it?
Particularly the Emirates, I think.
Yes.
But you could say this of Bahrain, you could say it of Morocco too. Pardon me. They're more realistic. They deal with the Palestinian Authority all the time. They know it isn't ready to govern Gaza. It can't even govern the West Bank. That's why I say I think a lot of this is domestic politics for the Europeans, Canadians, Australians. The unreality of it doesn't matter to them. The failure to set conditions doesn't matter to them. The ridiculous acceptance of 20-year-old pledges by President Abbas doesn't matter to them.
Now, you have a lot of people who are skeptical of the Palestinian Authority. I mean, it's sort of unique to this argument. Like since October 7th, the focus, of course, has been on Hamas and the IDF's campaign. Netanyahu stated war goals to destroy Hamas, but so much of your argument is focused on the PA. You have deep familiarity with the PA, with Mahmoud Abbas, right, the leader of the PA. Why? What is your sort of explanation as to this is they're not ready for statehood? That these 19 plus years of pledges. What have you seen, both in your time in government and outside of government, that gives you zero confidence that this is anything beyond performative politics and theater?
We've seen this movie before.
Right.
Palestinians have been, I don't know, plagued, let's say, by terrible, terrible leadership, starting with Amin al-Husseini, who spent the war year as the Grand Mufti in Berlin, supporting Hitler. Then Yasser Arafat, a terrorist. Now Abbas, who started out looking a lot better, but now has kept himself and cronies in power for 19 years without an election. Part of the problem, is us. That is, the West, the Israelis, the Canadians, the Australians, the Europeans. When efforts were really made to start building a state by the former Palestinian Prime Minister and Finance Minister Salam Fayyad about 20 years ago, what all of our government said was, this is great, this is absolutely fine, but then made it a secondary or tertiary issue because we were all more interested in summit meetings and, big conferences with flags flying and, frankly, the White House lawn, more than we were interested in the hard, boring work of building institutions. And many in the Palestinian leadership and many in the Palestinian population were not interested in that either. When Fayyad ran in 2006 in that parliamentary election that Hamas won, he got 2.4% of the vote for his state building efforts. So we go back to I think the problem of personalities like Abbas, but the deeper problem, which is Palestinians don't really want a state. Europeans and others want them to have a state, but the poll data right now shows that while the Europeans are pushing for Palestinian statehood, majorities in both Israel and among the Palestinians are not in favor of the two-state solution because they realize it's not a solution.
A couple of interesting things have been happening in the West Bank and Gaza, Judea-Samaria. Well, sorry, Judea-Samaria and the West Bank, not Gaza. One, you have this discussion over annexation, which seems to be sort of a reaction to. I mean, there are forces, of course, in the Netanyahu government, Ben-Gvir and Smotrich, who have been advocating this from the outset. But Netanyahu, as prime minister, has at times shown more focus or less focus, more enthusiasm, less enthusiasm for annexation. These days, in light of the recognition by the UK, Australia, France, and Canada of a Palestinian state, the reporting suggests Netanyahu is favoring some form of annexation. There's been discussion in terms of what that means. Is it total annexation of settlements and the like? Explain how this discussion over the West Bank annexation fits into the overall discussion of recognition of a Palestinian state and the Netanyahu government.
Well, you've correctly said the Netanyahu government, relies on support from some on what I'd call the far right, who have always favored annexation. Netanyahu has not traditionally favored it. In fact, Netanyahu, I would say, has generally favored expanding the large settlement towns and cities like Ma'ale Adumim, 40,000 people, Ariel, 25,000 people. He has not favored the kind of small settlements all over the place because annexation would seem to mean that Israel now has an Arab majority, a Palestinian majority. Who's in favor of that? What has that got to do with Zionism and building a Jewish state? Right. So let me say, personally, I think it's a very, very bad idea. And I think, I said a couple of minutes ago that what the Europeans, Canadians, Australians were doing was not anything serious to help Palestinians. They were striking at Israel. To go for annexation now, it seems to me, is also just sort of striking back and saying, oh yeah, we'll show you, without looking at the long-term interests of Israel. I don't think the long-term interests of Israel are to bring 2, or if you count Gaza, 4, 5 million Palestinians into the Jewish state.
Well, if you're going to have a Jewish democratic state, the demographics really matter here. And at a certain point, hard to have a Jewish democratic state if the population is sort of 50-50 or 60-40 as opposed to what it otherwise is. Not only do you think it's a bad idea to pursue annexation of West Bank. But reporting is that President Trump also thinks it's a bad idea.
Yes, and
Take
I
us
think
through the American. We'll just use that. Take us through the American policy, both in terms of the Trump administration and President Trump pushing against annexation, and then at the same time, it's pushing back against allies recognizing the Palestinian state and supporting Netanyahu's military operation, the latest military operation in Gaza City, as he pursues the destruction of Hamas.
No president of the U.S. has ever favored annexation, and I think Trump's view and the view of people like Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, is, look, Palestinians and Israelis should be separated. They seem to want to be. You have these entities. You have Gaza. You have the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. And we got to figure out some relationship here. But Israel shouldn't just say, no, it's all part of Israel, because then you get to the problem of democracy. You also get to the problem of security, which you have now with Gaza. So I think that's Trump's view. Why does this help anything? It doesn't. We got to figure this out. To me, one of the really terrible things about everybody saying, and this everybody includes Joe Biden, it includes Tony Blinken, his Secretary of State, it includes the British Prime Minister and the French President. When asked about this, they say, oh, there is no alternative. You mention all of the problems, there is no alternative. And to me, one of the worst things about this recognition is that it is again saying, don't think about an alternative. Don't think about how partition into a Jewish and Arab entity might be achieved the way we've been talking about for over 100 years. No, can't talk about that. Only the two-state solution. Actually, there are alternatives, and the alternatives should be talked about.
So pursue those for a moment. What are some of the alternatives? You hit on this in your article.
Well, the one that isn't going to work is the one-state solution,
right,
which is really a form of annexation because it creates an Arab majority. I ask, if you have a Palestinian entity, let's just take the West Bank first, landlocked, poor, really no natural resources, no economy, it's going to end up, if you create it, in a partnership, a confederation with one of its two neighbors, Jordan or Israel. What's logical? What makes more sense? To be in a confederation with a Jewish, Hebrew-speaking state, or in a confederation with an Arabic-speaking Muslim state that's already half Palestinian? And there are a number of arrangements you can think of for doing this. I'll just give you one example. Kurdistan. Kurdistan is part of Iraq, but with a very large amount of autonomy, self-rule in that province. You could see that in the West Bank. Others have argued for more than one province of Palestine because places like Jenin, Hebron, Ramallah are different. But nobody's allowed to talk about that.
That certainly has sort of this colonialist, you're not allowing the self-determination of the Palestinian people would be the critique. From an Israeli standpoint, Elliott, if you just pursued that line of thinking, put aside what King Abdullah of Jordan might not want. I mean, I think the west of the Jordan is something he does probably not, is a headache he would otherwise not want to have. But put that aside for a moment. From an Israeli security standpoint, post-October 7th, could Israel's presence, the occupation, the military occupation, that's not a political statement, it's a description of what the state of affairs looks like in the West Bank, is something that it would be hard to walk away from in terms of where what happened October 7th and what's available for relatively kind of small amount of money to wreak havoc on Israelis, not just within the West Bank, but as you point out, Israelis in Tel Aviv. I mean, is it really sort of realistic at this point where Israel, after October 7th, could give up a security presence in the West Bank?
It is not today.
Yeah.
But, it's 58 years. The unsustainable occupation is now 58 years old. And if you come back, if we do this show 5 years from now, I think the situation in the West Bank would be very similar to what it is today. But if we're looking for a long-term, medium-term solution, 10 years from today, let's say, 15 years from today, yes, Israel can't leave the West Bank for security reasons. But the Israeli-Jordanian security cooperation has been going on for decades.
True.
And one of the advantages of a Jordanian-Palestinian confederation is that the Jordanian army and secret police, the Mukhabarat, would be there to keep order in the West Bank and fight radicalism the way they do in Jordan. Now that's an advantage, not a disadvantage.
That's a great point. There is coordination and cooperation. I'm curious to get your assessment of it presently between Palestinian security forces that are part of the PA and the Israeli Defense Forces. It's certainly not something that's covered in the New York Times and others as an area of collaboration and an example of success, because it would reinforce a model that those media outlets would deem unacceptable. But as much as you've dismissed the political leadership of Mahmoud Abbas, isn't there a positive story in terms of IDF cooperation with the Palestinian security forces? It's waxed and waned over the years. Is it a net positive?
It is a positive story, but let's remember that the Shin Bet and the IDF are active in Judea and Samaria every day.
Yes.
Without them, it would fail. I think that's clear, because they'd rather not be there. So if they thought the PA can handle it on its own, they'd let it do so. So it's a positive story of cooperation, just as I think there would could someday be a story of cooperation between Palestinian security forces in the West Bank and Jordanian security forces. So the difference is that in Jordan, the security forces keep order themselves. In the West Bank, the PA security forces can't do it without the Israelis.
So one of the facets here, really on the security front, we talked about politically, is where the Arab countries play here. And I'm going from the West Bank, from Judea Samaria, into Gaza.
Mm-hmm.
What prospect, if any, do you see a sort of Arab security and perhaps political element coming in and contributing to a post-Hamas Gaza? I mean, Prime Minister Netanyahu has said, we don't want to remain in Gaza. We don't want to own Gaza, although the footprint and the approach from a security standpoint and perhaps the politics of his coalition suggests that Gaza will look more like the West Bank in the form of IDF occupation than anything else. But there does continue to be this chatter, notably from the Trump administration, notably from Envoy Wickoff, that those Arab states that have not joined Canada, UK, Australia, and France are actually the ones being disbanding about this idea that they'll have some role in a post-Hamas Gaza. What are your thoughts on the prospects of that? Is that a pipe dream?
I don't think it's a pipe dream. I think it's hard. I think security in Gaza is going to be messy. It's messy now. It's under the Israelis. It's going to be messy if the Israelis begin to pull out. It will end up, I think, being a combination of some Palestinian police who we have trained either in Egypt or in Jordan, some private security, and maybe some of the Arab security forces. I think it's plausible. At a minimum, for example, if we're saying to Arabs, okay, you're putting in a refugee camp, you're building a new hospital, you're building a new school, protect it. Send your security forces in to protect that site. The problem, I think, is who's going to shoot Hamas guys.
Yeah.
I mean, let's get right down to the bottom. Somebody's got to go beyond saying, no, you can't cross this street. When Hamas tries to rebuild, somebody's got to be willing to fight. And that's going to be much tougher for any of the Arab forces because they have populations. They're not democracies, but they have public opinion. And they're not going to want to see, Egyptian, Saudi, Emirati force kills Palestinian. So you are going to need Israelis to have a kind of overwatch and be willing at least to raid the way they are in the West Bank.
There's a critique out there that, or actually, I'll flip that. It's not a critique. There's a point of view that suggests if Netanyahu's coalition would only fall, the elements you referenced before as the far-right elements, Minister Smotrich, Minister Ben-Gvir, were no longer in the government, and you had a more centrist, right-of-center government, that it looked different. Hostages, a deal with a ceasefire with Hamas would materialize. Hostages, 48 as the time of this recording, remain. Some 20 plus are believed to be alive, would be freed. And there'd be some sort of political and security framework that could be realized within Gaza, perhaps with some of these elements. Do you buy into that? Is this truly something that hinges on Israeli politics? I've had conversation with diplomats here in Washington, D.C., allies, that really believe it's sort of Netanyahu's government that's holding this up, not the elements that gave us October 7th. What's your take?
That is not my take. I have several times heard Brett McGurk, who handled these things during the Biden administration, say,
and the Bush administration on these things, but he's a veteran of.
There was never a moment when Hamas said yes and Netanyahu said no. Look, I would remind people that President Trump himself thought a lot of these problems were solvable if you just get rid of Joe Biden.
Yes.
One was Gaza, the other was Ukraine. Could solve it in a day. He's been unable to do that. I don't even say that critically. I'm reminded that Benny Gantz, former head of the opposition, still a key member of it, wrote recently that, well, in any resolution in the West Bank, Israel, of course, has to have the Jordan Valley. So it's just a reminder that on these security issues, the distance between Netanyahu and several of the people trying to replace him, Gantz is one, Bennett is another, is tiny. There are other issues, domestic issues in Israel on which they differ a lot, not on these
security ones. Yeah, I mean, there is one other area I think they differ, or certainly in approach. I mean, Bibi Netanyahu has been prime minister in Israel longer than any other prime minister. He goes back decades at this point. His tenure beats Ben-Gurion, the founder of the State of Israel. And he is someone who famously, his English is great. He's lived in America, MIT, Boston Consulting, ambassador to UN on behalf of Israel. And some people, the critique is that perhaps he thinks he knows America better than he does, or doesn't fully allow for other points of view in considering the America and the West. And I'm curious whether you think he perhaps is overplaying his hand, both with Western democracies and specifically with the United States. And I'll frame it in the following way, and then we'll wrap up our discussion. Israel seems to have to balance two things: being feared in their neighborhood. This is someone else's construct. I can't recall who, but I very much agree with this. And that is from Hamas to Hezbollah to Iran and others, Houthis included, and then being loved by the West. Because at the end of the day, these are allies and partners, and every country, particularly small countries, need allies and partners. And that's a balance between being loved by your natural partners, friends, and allies, and being feared by your adversaries. Do you think Netanyahu has sort of underestimated the amount of love Israel needs to get through?
That's a very hard question. I've known him for about 40 years, 45 years, I think, and consider him a friend. But I would have to say that there comes a point when you've been in power so long that the balance of friends and enemies begins to shift. It happened to Margaret Thatcher. It happened to Tony Blair. it happens to everyone, and it the two-term limit in the United States, I think, is a reflection of the view that even for George Washington, there should be time limits. And most people who talk about an Israeli constitution talk about putting in some kind of maybe 10-year time limit for prime ministers. I think it's going to be very, very difficult now for Israel to win back some of the support it had after the war, after the Gaza war, because Prime Minister Netanyahu has become really the point of so much criticism. And that in a way that isn't even a criticism of him. It's the passage of time and events. But I actually do think that it'll be more difficult with him as prime minister than it would be with someone else who did not have that history.
That's a great point. It sort of has diminishing returns, and it's not even necessarily about him. It's all those battles fought, which every leader needs to fight. And at a certain point, it doesn't allow that leader to succeed. Last question with Elliott Abrams. Thank you so much for coming back on the show. Let's go back to the United States.
Okay.
At the end of the day, it's the American outlook that is the fulcrum of what Reaganism is about and what we're focusing on here. You're someone who knows a lot about demographics, thinks a lot about how politics impact policy. One of the things that we've seen a shift on in terms of U.S. views towards Israel, a lot of ink spilled on Democrats, Democratic Party, certainly opposed to Netanyahu's government, and more broadly opposed to Israel. Certainly elements are opposed to, not Zionist. But there's also the demographic, or sorry, the age, the 18 to 30 demographic, that is increasingly skeptical and questioning the U.S.-Israel relationship. Where do things stand with that right now, where we are here in approaching the second 2 years after October 7th?
It worries me a lot. We see it on the fringes of both parties. We see it, as you've said, according to age. Younger Democrats less supportive of Israel than their parents or grandparents. Younger Republicans, in some cases. Younger evangelicals.
Yes.
And that's a community that's been strongly supportive of Israel. Part of this, I think, is what people are learning in college, which is in some of our best institutions, ahistorical, and very, very hostile to Israel. So I think the Israelis need to do a better job. I think the American Jewish community does. There are groups that are working on this. I think of the Philos Project. I think of Passages Israel that are dedicated to working with and educating young evangelicals, young Catholics, taking them in some cases to Israel to see with their own eyes what's.
It's amazing how many people are anti-Israel have never been there, right? They make assumptions about this white colonialist country that is sort of fascist, and then you realize it's a lot more brown, heavily democratic than they would otherwise have assumed.
Yeah, but I think from the Israeli point of view and from the American Jewish point of view, we've obviously passed the days. Maybe the height was maybe 1990. Something like that, 2000, when Israel was a completely bipartisan issue. And it is now a subject of real concern, I think, for anybody, Jewish or Christian, Israeli or American, to watch those changing numbers. And it really should get more attention and more effort, I would say, within the pro-Israel community in the United States than it's been getting or needed 10, 20, 30 years ago.
Yeah, it's one that we should continue to keep an eye on. I mean, to me, and think about American interests, it really goes down to freedom. I mean, this is a democratic state. As we look at that neighborhood How could the U.S. be anything other than a partner and ally? And to the extent we're de-emphasizing that word freedom in our foreign policy, in our outlook, something that's core to the founding principles of this country, as others have said, it actually portends bad things for the United States if we're not standing with other countries that are also free and democratic.
Free and democratic and pro-American. And if you look at the polls of every country in the Middle East, there's one that stands out as pro-American, as really loving America. And that's our friends in Israel.
Elliott Abrams, thank you so much for joining the show again. We'll definitely call on you in the future.
It's a pleasure, Roger, as always. Thank you.